The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. My Geiger counter had stopped clicking an hour ago, not because the radiation was gone, but because the batteries had finally surrendered to the relentless Sahara sun. I licked lips that felt like sandpaper. I was 3 days out from the convoy, tracking a distress signal that shouldn't exist. A signal that claimed there was a safe zone out here in the great empty. But looking at the dunes rippling in the heat haze, I knew I was walking into a grave. Then I saw it. Not a mirage. A structure. It wasn't a building, but a jagged scar of concrete protruding from the sand, half buried by decades of shifting winds. A heavy blast door, angled toward the sky like a tombstone. I slid down the dune, sand filling my boots, my tactical vest heavy with the last of my ammunition. The silence out here was absolute, until I reached the metal. I pressed my ear against the scorching steel. Vibration. Faint, rhythmic, mechanical vibration. Something was alive down there. I gripped the manual override wheel, the metal searing my gloves. With a groan of rusted hydraulics that echoed across the desert floor, the seal broke. The air that rushed out didn't smell like stale bunker air. It smelled of ozone. It smelled of copper blood. And underneath it all, that distinct, sweet rot that every survivor knows too well. The smell of the infected. I clicked my radio. Static. I was alone. I pulled my sidearm, clicked the flashlight on, and descended into the throat of the earth. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The sunlight from the open hatch above became a distant square of white, then vanished as the tunnel curved. My boots crunched on glass. Not sand. Glass. I swept the beam across the walls. This wasn't a standard fallout shelter. The walls were lined with heavy reinforced steel bars. Cell doors. Rows of them. Some were open, blasted off their hinges. Others were sealed tight, with scratch marks dug deep into the metal from the inside. I found an abandoned underground prison in the Sahara Desert. But as I moved deeper, stepping over a discarded lab coat stained with dried black fluid, I realized the cells weren't meant to keep people in. They were meant to keep something else from getting out. I stopped. The vibration was louder here. Hum of a generator? No. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. It wasn't a machine. It was a shuffling sound. Hundreds of feet, dragging against concrete. Leather on stone. Throat noises. Wet, clicking growls echoing up from the darkness below. I checked my mag 12 rounds. I adjusted the strap of my rifle, the cold metal biting into my neck. I wasn't the first one to find this place. The bodies near the security checkpoint proved that. But they hadn't died from the infected. They had bullet holes in their backs. Execution style. Someone had tried to clean this place up and failed. I stepped over a corpse wearing a faded patch that I didn't recognize. The shuffling grew louder. A shadow detached itself from the gloom at the end of the corridor. It twitched, disjointed and unnatural. Then another shadow. And another. The ozone smell spiked, sharp and electric. I raised my weapon. The prison wasn't abandoned. It was full. The heat above ground had been a physical weight, a hammer pounding against the anvil of the dunes. But as the heavy blast door of the facility groaned shut behind me, the oppression shifted. It wasn't the heat anymore. It was the silence. The air in the airlock was cool, recycled decades ago and trapped like a spirit in a bottle, tasting of ozone, copper, and ancient dust. I clicked my flashlight on. The beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the intake station of what the faded stenciling on the wall called Facility 7 Alpha. Containment and correction. An underground supermax prison, buried beneath the Sahara to ensure that whatever, or whoever, was sent here never walked out again. I wasn't here for justice. I was here for calories and caliber. My supplies were critically low. The last of my water was sloshing in a canteen that felt terrifyingly light. and my sidearm had 3 rounds left in the magazine. I swept the beam across the intake desk. Papers were scattered, yellowed and brittle as dead leaves. A coffee mug sat undisturbed, the liquid inside long since evaporated into a dark, resinous stain. I moved behind the desk, boots crunching on grit. Scavenging is an art of priorities. I ignored the paperwork and went for the drawers. The first was empty. The second held a treasure trove that would have been garbage in the old world: a half-empty box of ballpoint pens, a roll of duct tape, and a flashlight battery. I pocketed the tape and battery. The third drawer was locked. A quick leverage strike with my combat knife popped the cheap mechanism. Inside I found a pristine stun baton, charged likely dead, and a set of heavy iron keys on a ring. No gun, but the baton was heavy, weighted steel wrapped in rubber. It would break bone even without the voltage. I moved deeper, past the metal detectors and into the main corridor. The architecture was brutalist, all sharp angles and unpainted concrete, designed to make you feel small. Here, I saw the first signs of the fall. There were no bodies, not yet, but there were drag marks. Long, scraping trails in the dust leading toward the lower levels. The blood splatter on the walls wasn't the rusty brown I was used to seeing in the cities. It was black, hardened into a substance that looked more like obsidian than biological matter. The arid environment didn't allow for rot, it mummified everything. I reached a security checkpoint overseeing sub-block A. The plexiglass was shattered. I vaulted over the counter, my eyes scanning for the armory or a guard's personal locker. In the corner, slumped against a filing cabinet, was the first one. It was a corpse, or so it seemed. The uniform was tattered, desert camouflage bleached almost white. The skin was pulled tight against the skull, leathery and dark, the lips receded to reveal teeth that looked too long. I approached with my knife raised, practicing the standard protocol, confirmed the kill. But as I leaned in, I noticed something strange. There was no smell of decay, just the scent of old leather and spice. And the skin, it wasn't just dried, it was armored. The viral infection, faced with the extreme desiccation of the Sahara, hadn't died. It had evolved. It had calcified the dermis, turning the skin into a natural carapace to retain moisture. I touched the creature's shoulder with the tip of my blade. The sound was like tapping on wood. Suddenly, the head snapped up. It didn't groan. The vocal cords had dried out long ago. Instead, it made a clicking sound, like dry branches breaking. It lunged, not with the shambling clumsiness of the urban infected, but with a spring-loaded tension. The tendons had tightened as they dried, turning the body into a biological torsion engine. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on the slick floor, and kicked out. My heel connected with its chest, and the sensation was like kicking a crate of dried driftwood. It flew back, hitting the lockers with a hollow crash. It scrambled up instantly, moving on all fours like a spider. I didn't waste a bullet. I swung the dead stun baton with both hands, aiming for the temple. The steel connected with a sickening crack, shattering the calcified layer of skin and caving in the dry bone beneath. Dust puffed out from the wound, spores. I held my breath, backing away as the thing twitched and finally went still. I pulled my respirator up, tightening the straps until they dug into my face. This was a new strain, the husk variant. They didn't bleed, they dusted. If you inhaled that cloud, the infection would likely start in the lungs, crystallizing the alveoli until you suffocated. I waited for the dust to settle before moving to the locker the thing had been guarding. Jackpot. Inside was a riot vest, heavy Kevlar with ceramic plates, and a tactical hydration pack, empty but intact. Better yet, on the top shelf, a box of 9mm ammunition. 50 rounds. I felt a rush of dopamine that was almost dizzying. I loaded my magazine to capacity, the click of the springs the most comforting sound in the world. I donned the vest. It was heavy, but in a place where the enemies were made of rock and bone, I needed the armor. I pushed further down, descending the stairs to level 2, the infirmary and research. The air got colder here. I needed to understand what I was fighting. If the husks were the result of the desert heat, what happened to the ones kept in the climate-controlled labs? I found the double doors of the medical wing, forced open and blocked by a gurney. I slipped inside. The looting here was specific. I wasn't looking for bandages. I needed antibiotics and stimulants. I swept the shelves, grabbing bottles of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a sealed container of epinephrine. Then I saw the logs. A clipboard hung by a quarantine cell, the dates from 3 years ago. Subject 14, the log read. Hypercoagulation of the blood observed. The virus is reacting to the arid intake air by sequestering fluids in the core organs. Subjects are entering a state of estivation, dormancy. They are not dead. They are waiting for water. Any introduction of moisture triggers a violent predatory response. I froze. Asterisk waiting for water. Asterisk. I looked at the hydration pack I had just scavenged. I looked at the sweat that was beginning to bead on my forehead under the heavy riot gear. I was a walking moisture source in a tomb of thirsty things. A noise echoed from the back of the infirmary. A hiss. Not a mechanical hiss, but the sound of air being drawn into dry lungs. I shone my light toward the back of the room, into the shadows of the recovery ward. Rows of beds. And on them, rows of husks. But the light reflected off something new. Crystal. The one rising from the bed at the far end was different. It wasn't just leathery. It was studded with jagged, red crystals protruding from its shoulders and chest. The blood hadn't just coagulated, it had crystallized into shards. The evolution had continued. The virus was weaponizing the host's own fluids, turning them into walking shrapnel bombs. It saw me. Or rather, it sensed the humidity of my breath. It let out a shriek that sounded like grinding glass. The other shapes on the beds began to stir, the clicking of their joints filling the room like a swarm of locusts. I didn't run. Running triggers the predator drive. I raised the pistol. The crystal husk charged, faster than the one upstairs. I fired. The round hit its chest, but instead of penetrating, it shattered one of the blood crystals. A spray of sharp, red shards exploded outward like a fragmentation grenade. I ducked, feeling the shards ping off my new helmet and vest. If I hadn't put that armor on, I'd be shredded. Headshots only, I whispered to myself, the sound muffled by the respirator. I adjusted my aim. The creature was 10 feet away, closing the gap. I fired again. The bullet struck the bridge of its nose. The skull shattered, not with a wet thud, but with an explosion of dust and crystal fragments. It dropped. But the others were up now. 6 of them. Standard husks, dry and fast. I saw a door marked storage hazmat behind them. That was the exit, and likely where the heavy-duty supplies were kept. I holstered the pistol and drew the baton. Ammo was precious. Muscle was renewable. I stepped forward, into the clicking swarm. The first one leapt, claws grasping. I sidestepped, swinging the baton into its knee. The leg snapped with a dry pop, and it tumbled. I stomped its head before it could recover. The next 2 came at once. I shoved the left one with my armored forearm, feeling its teeth scrape harmlessly against the ceramic plate, and drove the baton into the throat of the right one. It collapsed, clutching a crushed windpipe that no longer needed air but structurally failed nonetheless. I fought my way to the hazmat door, the physical exertion drenching me in sweat. I knew the scent was driving them into a frenzy. I kicked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, engaging the manual deadbolt just as the bodies slammed against the other side. The scratching started immediately. Desperate, rhythmic scratching. I turned my light to the room I was in. It wasn't just storage. It was a water reclamation plant for the prison. Huge tanks, silent pipes. And in the center, a crate marked with the hazard symbol for bioorganic. I pried the lid off. Inside wasn't a weapon. It was a prototype hydroponic setup, seeds, nutrient paste, and a portable filtration unit designed for infinite recycling. Survival. Real survival. But as I looked at the gauges on the water tanks, I saw the problem. The pressure was zero. The tanks were dry. The pipes led down, through a grate in the floor, into the darkness of level 3. To get the water to make the seeds grow, to survive this desert, I had to go deeper. Into the heart of the nest. Into the place where the husks had likely piled up by the thousands, seeking the last drop of moisture in the facility. I checked my magazine. 48 rounds. I took a sip from my canteen, the last drop, and let the empty metal clatter to the floor. The sound echoed down the grate, and from the abyss below, 1,000 clicking joints answered. The hydraulic hiss of the manual override lever was the loudest sound I'd heard in 3 weeks. Outside, the dune sea whispered with the relentless friction of sand against sand, a white noise torture that never ended. Inside the airlock of the subterranean facility, the silence was heavy, pressurized, and smelled of ozone and ancient, stale copper. I let the heavy steel wheel spin back into place, sealing out the blinding Sahara sun. The darkness was absolute until the beam of my tactical light cut a cone through dust motes that had been suspended in the stagnant air for what looked like a decade. This wasn't just a prison. The faded stenciling on the blast door read MK4 Containment Site, Ozymandias. A black site. A hole in the world where people were thrown to be forgotten, and where the infection had been studied in its infancy. My boots crunched on the grate flooring. First priority, security. Second, water. Third, answers. I moved with the practiced slow walk of a scavenger who knows that noise is death, keeping my customized pry bar raised. The lobby was a tomb. The reception desk, armored with bulletproof glass, was intact. Behind it, a skeleton sat in a swivel chair, slumped over a console, a dried black stain radiating from the temple. Suicide. A common sight. I bypassed the door using a magnetic bypass tool I'd looted from a convoy in Algiers. The battery was dying. But the lock clicked open with a satisfying clunk. The air grew colder as I descended the spiral ramp towards Sector A. The temperature drop was the first blessing. The desert surface cooked the infected, usually baking them into a mobile jerky within days, but down here, the thermal insulation preserved everything. That was the danger. Scavenging the admin offices on the first sublevel proved lucrative immediately. In a break room, I found a cache of unopened water cooler jugs. The plastic had leached a bit of chemical taste into the water over the years, but it was wet and didn't require filtration. I drank greedily, feeling the cool liquid hit my stomach like a stone. Next to the water, a vending machine. I smashed the glass with the butt of my pry bar, wrapping a rag around it to muffle the sound. Protein bars. Chalky, expired but calorie-dense. I swept them into my pack, counting 24 units. That was 2 weeks of life, right there. But the real prize was the armory. The heavy cage door had been welded shut from the inside, a sign of desperate last stands. I spent an hour drilling through the locking mechanism with a hand crank. Inside, the racks were mostly stripped, but the floor was littered with discarded shell casings and empty magazines. In the back, under a tarp, I found it, a crate of riot control canisters and 2 full boxes of 12-gauge slug rounds. The slugs were crucial. The standard infected, the shamblers I dealt with in the cities, were soft targets. But out here, and especially down deep, rumors of the carapaced variants persisted. The virus, denied easy biomass, supposedly hardened the skin of the host, turning the epidermis into a callous shield to retain moisture. I moved deeper, to the medical wing on sublevel 3. This is where the story of the fall was written in blood and overturned gurneys. The walls were lined with containment cells, glass-fronted and reinforced. Most were empty, save for grim stains. One, however, was occupied. I approached the glass, wiping away a layer of grime. Inside, a figure stood motionless, facing the rear wall. It didn't look like the rotters on the surface. Its skin was gray, not green or necrotic black. It looked like stone. Ridges of bone had spurred out through the shoulders and spine, tearing the orange jumpsuit. I stepped back, my boots scuffing the linoleum. The figure snapped its head around 180 degrees with a sickening crack of vertebrae. It had no eyes, just smooth, calcified growth over the sockets. It didn't scream, it clicked. A sound like rocks grinding together in a mixer. This was the evolution. The virus, isolated in the dark and cold, hadn't just consumed the host, it had fortified it. The geode, that's what the file on the nearby desk called it. Subject 819. I grabbed the clipboard. The notes were frantic scrawls dated 5 years after the initial outbreak. Subject shows complete dermal calcification. Photosensitivity 0. Echolocation development probable. Hunger dormant but activates upon vibration. I froze. The clicking intensified. The creature wasn't seeing me, it was mapping me. I looked at the glass. It was thick, polylaminated, intended for maximum security. But the seal around the frame had dry rotted in the arid recycled air. The creature lunged. It didn't hit with fists, it slammed its entire shoulder into the glass like a battering ram. The sound was deafening in the enclosed hallway. A spiderweb fracture bloomed in the center of the pane. I didn't run. Running triggers the chase instinct, and in a confined space, you die tired. I switched my grip on the pry bar to the sharpened end and unholstered the flare gun I kept for emergencies. The geode hit the glass again. Shards of safety laminate rained down. One more hit. I aimed the flare gun not at the creature, but at the fire suppression sensor on the ceiling above it. The glass shattered outward. The creature burst through, a juggernaut of bone and gray flesh, moving with terrifying speed for something so heavy. I fired. The flare struck the sensor. A burst of halon gas and emergency strobe lights exploded into the hallway. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, grinding noise, as the flashing strobes disoriented its echolocation. It swung wildly, its bone-spurred arm gouging a trench in the concrete wall inches from my face. I dropped low, sweeping its legs with the pry bar. It was like hitting a statue, the impact vibrating up my arms, but the physics held, it toppled. I didn't wait for it to rise. I scrambled over its thrashing form, driving the pry bar into the soft tissue under the jaw, the only vulnerability I could see. It took 3 strikes to penetrate the thickened cartilage. Black, viscous fluid, thick as tar, bubbled up. The creature seized, vibrating violently, before going limp. I stood up, breathing hard, the adrenaline acid sharp in my veins. I looted the body. Not for items, but for data. I sliced a sample of the hardened skin and bottled the black fluid. If there were survivors out there, if there was still a cure being researched, this phenotype was critical data. Pushing past the corpse, I entered the main lab. This was the jackpot. It wasn't just medicine, it was infrastructure. A portable solar generator, still in its crate. Boxes of broad-spectrum antibiotics that hadn't been cooked by the sun. And in the center, a sealed biosafe fridge hooked up to a backup battery that was blinking red, close to death. Inside were vials of blue liquid labeled Viral Inhibitor Phase 2. Not a cure, but a pause button. I loaded my pack until the straps dug into my shoulders. The facility groaned around me, the thermal expansion of the metal structure shifting in the cooling earth. There were deeper levels, sub-level 4 and 5, marked incubation. I could hear faint scratching coming from the ventilation shafts leading down there, thousands of scratchings, like a hive waking up. The vibration of the fight had stirred them. The geodes were the guards, but something else was breeding in the dark below. I retreated to the airlock, sealing the blast doors of Sector behind me. I welded them shut with a portable thermite torch found in maintenance. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would hold them long enough. As I climbed back into the airlock and prepared to face the blinding Sahara sun, I realized the desert wasn't the threat anymore. The desert was the lid on a pressure cooker, and I had just turned up the heat. I had the supplies to survive for months, maybe a year. But I also had the knowledge that beneath the sand, the infection wasn't dying. It was armoring up for a war. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 3 weeks. It screamed of pressurized stagnation, a seal breaking on a tomb that the Sahara had tried to swallow whole. As the heavy steel grinding stopped, the blinding white intensity of the desert sun was instantly severed by the abyssal gloom of the intake ramp. I stood on the precipice between the scorching world above and the frigid, stale unknown below. The air rushing out didn't smell like rot, which was my first warning. It smelled of ozone, copper, and dust so ancient it tasted like iron on my tongue. I adjusted the straps of my rucksack, the nylon biting into my sunburned shoulders, and clicked on my tactical light. The beam cut a cone through the swirling motes of sand, illuminating a concrete throat descending into the earth. This wasn't just a prison. The architectural brutality suggested a black site. A place where people were sent to be erased long before the world ended. I moved with the practiced silence of a scavenger who had outlived the noisy ones. My boots, wrapped in rags to muffle their tread, found purchase on the grit-covered metal stairs. Step 1. Secure the perimeter. Step 2. Find water. Step 3. Anything that could punch a hole in a skull. The upper reception area was a chaotic tableau of abandonment. Papers were strewn across the floor, preserved perfectly by the zero-humidity environment. I knelt by a heavy steel desk, my gloved fingers rifling through drawers. No weapons, standard procedure for a front desk, but I found a box of blue ballpoint pens and, more importantly, a sealed blister pack of AA batteries. Gold dust. I swapped the dying cells in my radio, though there was nobody to talk to. It was a habit, a ritual of hope. Deeper in, past the metal detectors and the shattered plexiglass of the visitation booths, the atmosphere shifted. The silence here had a texture, heavy and oppressive. I entered what looked like a staff locker room. This was the scavenging jackpot. The lockers were military-grade, heavy-gauge steel. I pried the first one open with the claw of my hammer. Inside hung a uniform, stiff with age, and a tactical vest. I stripped the vest, checking the pockets. A half-full pack of gum, a photo of a woman smiling in front of a fountain, and a combat knife with a serrated spine. I swapped my dull paring knife for the combat blade, testing the weight. Perfect balance. The next locker yielded a prize that made my heart hammer against my ribs, a filtered hydration pack. The bladder was dry and brittle, likely useless, but the filtration unit in the straw was salvageable. In a world where water killed you faster than the thirst, filters were life. It was in the hallway leading to cell block A that I found the first one. The infection, as I knew it, was a wet, messy business. It was bloat, bile, and liquefying organs. But the Sahara had changed the rules. The corpse slumped against the wall wasn't rotting, it was cured. The skin was pulled tight over the skull like parchment, dark and leathery. The lips had retracted, revealing teeth that seemed too long for the jaw. I approached cautiously, my hammer raised. This was a deviation. The virus usually burned through the host's metabolism, consuming them from the inside out until they collapsed into sludge. But here, the heat and the isolation had halted the decay. I nudged the boot of the corpse. It slid across the floor with the sound of dry wood dragging on concrete. It didn't move. I relaxed slightly, leaning in to check the belt for ammo pouches. That was my mistake. There was no groan, no guttural growl. There was only the sound of snapping tendons. The thing moved with the jerky, explosive speed of a trap springing shut. Its hand, a claw of fused bone and dried flesh, lashed out and gripped my ankle. The grip was like iron. It wasn't driven by hunger. There was no stomach left to fill. It was driven by a pure crystalline electrical impulse trapped in a dried-out nervous system. I kicked at its face, my boot connecting with a sickening crunch, like stepping on dry autumn leaves. It didn't let go. It hauled itself up, its joints popping loudly, the desiccated muscles generating torque that shouldn't have been possible. I swung the hammer. The blow struck the temple, not splashing brain matter, but cracking the skull like a ceramic pot. Dust puffed out from the fracture. The thing twitched, the light behind its milky, sunken eyes fading as the structural integrity of its head failed. I scrambled back, breathing hard. This was new. This was bad. They didn't bleed out. You had to shatter them. I pressed on, adrenaline sharpening my senses. The prison was evolving the infection, or perhaps preserving its most lethal state. I reached the security station overlooking the main block. The control panels were dead, but the logs were sitting right there on the desk, an open binder. I shone my light on the pages. Subject 44B exhibits halted necrosis due to environmental aridity. Viral colonies have entered a crystalline dormancy. Highly reactive to vibration. Crystalline dormancy. The words chilled me despite the heat. The virus wasn't just biological anymore. It was mineralizing. It was fortifying the hosts. I looked out through the reinforced glass at the cell block below. It was a cavernous space, rows of cells rising 4 stories high. And it was full. Hundreds of them. They were standing still, perfectly motionless, looking like statues carved from bog oak. They were in hibernation, solar-powered batteries waiting for a switch to flip. I needed to cross that block to get to the infirmary. The medical wing would have antibiotics, painkillers, maybe even morphine. I couldn't go back empty-handed. I scanned the room for options and my eyes landed on a riot shield leaning against the gun rack. The rack itself was empty, looted years ago, but the shield was heavy, polycarbonate scarred but intact. I strapped it to my left arm. In the corner, a dusty locker marked Riot Control sat slightly ajar. I pried it open. Flashbangs. 3 of them. I didn't know if the chemical compound would still be active after all this time, but it was a chance. The descent into the block was an exercise in terror. Every step on the metal grating rang out like a gunshot in the silence. Below me, the sea of dark, leathery heads remained still. I kept my light off, navigating by the dim shafts of sunlight piercing through high barred windows. I made it to the 2nd level before disaster struck. A loose bolt, rusted through, gave way under my boot. It fell, tumbling down, hitting the railing on the 1st floor, then the concrete ground. Asterisk clang. 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 Asterisk. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a roar, it was a hiss, a collective intake of air through dried windpipes. Hundreds of heads snapped upward in unison. The sound of shifting leather and popping joints filled the cavern. Then they screamed. It was a dry, high-pitched shriek, like metal grinding on metal. They surged toward the stairs. I didn't run. I moved with calculated desperation. I pulled the pin on the first flashbang and dropped it over the railing. I counted to 2 and shut my eyes. The explosion was muted, a dull thud, but the flash turned the dark cavern into magnesium white. The shrieks intensified, turning into chaotic flailing. They were photosensitive. The dormancy made their eyes hypersensitive to sudden input. I sprinted along the gantry, the riot shield up. A husk vaulted the railing, its movements defying gravity, scrambling like a spider. It collided with the shield, the impact jarring my shoulder. I thrust outward, shoving it over the edge. It fell silently, shattering on the concrete below. I reached the infirmary door. Locked. Electronic maglock. No power. Damn it! I hissed, slamming my shoulder against it. Behind me, the tide of dried death was flowing up the stairs. I could hear their claws scrabbling on the metal. I needed a pry bar. I jammed the claw of my hammer into the seam of the door and heaved. The metal groaned. The first husk reached the landing. I pulled the second flashbang, rolling it down the catwalk. The bang bought me 5 seconds. I put my boot against the doorframe and pulled on the hammer with everything I had left. The lock shattered, the door screeching open. I tumbled inside, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt just as the bodies slammed against the other side. The door shook, dust raining down from the frame. I backed away, light sweeping the room. It wasn't just an infirmary. It was a lab. Centrifuges, microscopes, and cooler units lined the walls. But it was the central table that drew my eye. A corpse lay there, strapped down, chest cavity open. But inside, there were no organs. The ribcage was filled with a glittering, amber-colored hive structure. The virus had completely replaced the biology. I realized then that the huskers outside were just the drones. This was the hive. I began to loot, my hands trembling. Surgical tubing, a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, a sealed box of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and a terrifyingly large syringe of something labeled necrosis inhibitor. I swept it all into my bag. The pounding on the door was getting rhythmic. They weren't just throwing themselves at it anymore, they were coordinating. The intelligence was evolving too. I looked for a secondary exit. A ventilation shaft, high on the wall. I dragged a heavy metal cabinet under it. As I climbed up, unscrewing the grate, the infirmary door hinges began to buckle. The metal screamed as it tore. I hauled myself into the vent, the smell of recycled air and dead things choking me. I pulled the grate back into place just as the door gave way. Below me, through the slats, I watched them pour in. They didn't look around aimlessly. They went straight to the table, to the body with the amber hive in its chest. They stood around it in a circle, swaying, a silent communion of the dead. I crawled deeper into the dark, clutching my bag of scavenged life, knowing that the desert hadn't just preserved the past. It was incubating the future. And the future was dry, hard, and hungry. The heavy iron wheel of the airlock turned with a shriek of protesting metal that echoed like a gunshot across the dunes, a sound so loud I froze, waiting for the desert to scream back. Nothing but the wind. I pushed the heavy steel door inward, the hinges grinding against years of accumulated sand, and stepped out of the blinding white sun of the Sahara and into the abyssal throat of the earth. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single step, the air shifting from a roasting dry heat to a stagnant, subterranean chill that smelled of copper, stale ozone, and something ancient, like a tomb sealed before the pyramids were stacked. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stagnant air, settling on a floor of polished concrete that had been scuffed by 1,000 frantic boots. This wasn't just a prison. The layout of the lobby, with its reinforced plexiglass checkpoints and decontamination showers, screamed black site containment. I moved to the intake desk, my boots crunching on scattered papers and shattered glass. Scavenging mode kicked in. In the desert, survival wasn't about bullets. It was about hydration and calories. I vaulted the desk, rifling through the drawers. Dried up ballpoint pens, a cracked terminal screen, and finally, jackpot, a forgotten stash of confiscated personal items. I found a half-empty pack of gum, a heavy Zippo lighter, and a multi-tool. Small victories. But the real prize was in the intake logs. I brushed the sand off a leather-bound ledger. The last entry was dated 3 years ago, just weeks after the initial outbreak. The handwriting was frantic, the ink stabbed into the paper. Subject 44B showing signs of desiccation dormancy. Necrosis halted. Hyperpreservation observed. Do not lower the humidity. I frowned. Dormancy? Back in the cities, the infected rotted. They bloated, burst, and eventually fell apart. Here, the dry air seemed to have done something else. I gripped my pry bar tighter and moved past the security checkpoint, forcing a jammed turnstile open. The corridor beyond descended into the dark, marked Cell Block A Maximum Security. The silence was oppressive, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I needed supplies. A prison this deep would have a canteen, maybe an infirmary with antibiotics, or an armory. I swept the light along the walls. They were lined with deep scratches, fingernail grooves etched into the cinder block. I found the first body near the stairwell. It wasn't a skeleton, and it wasn't a router. It looked like beef jerky stretched over a frame of steel wire. The skin was dark, leathered, and pulled tight against the skull. The lips receded to reveal teeth that looked too large for the face. It was mummified, perfectly preserved by the zero-humidity environment. I nudged it with my boot. It was hard as wood. I knelt, checking the tactical belt it wore, a guard. I unclipped a canteen. Bone dry. I took the baton, a solid telescoping steel rod, and swapped it for my rusted pipe. Better balance. As I descended to the second level, the air quality changed. It grew thinner, sharper. I found the infirmary behind a shattered glass door. This was the Holy Grail. I stepped over overturned gurneys, my lights sweeping over shelves stripped bare of narcotics, but still holding basics. Bandages, rubbing alcohol, saline drips. I stuffed my pack, greedily shoving boxes of gauze and surgical tape inside. Then I saw the containment tubes. Along the back wall, 6 cylindrical glass chambers stood floor to ceiling. 3 were shattered, empty. 3 were intact. Inside them stood the infected, motionless. They were terrifying. The infection here hadn't made them mindless shamblers. It had evolved them into ambushed predators. The biology was visibly different. Their skin had calcified, forming a natural armor plating over the chest and forearms. Their fingers had elongated, the nails fusing with the bone to create serrated claws. They weren't breathing. They were in stasis. I stepped closer to the glass, fascinated and horrified. A placard read, "Strain Delta Sahara. Hydrosensitive. Hydrosensitive." The realization hit me a split second before a drop of sweat from my forehead, heavy with the exertion of the descent, splashed onto the floor. The sound was microscopic, but in the silence, it was a thunderclap. Inside the tank, the creature's eyes snapped open. They weren't milky white. They were pitch black, devoid of moisture, reflecting my flashlight beam like obsidian. It didn't moan. It shrieked, a high-pitched, dry sound like grinding stones, and slammed against the glass. The impact spiderwebbed the reinforced containment. The vibration woke the others. From the dark corners of the infirmary, piles of rags I had dismissed as laundry began to unfold. They cracked and popped as stiff, desiccated joints snapped back into alignment. I scrambled back, raising the baton. The glass of the tank shattered, raining shards onto the linoleum. The creature fell out, twitching. It didn't stumble. It moved with insect-like speed, jerking upright. It sniffed the air, tracking the moisture of my breath. The desert had stripped them of water, making them crave it with a biological imperative that overrode everything else. They didn't want my flesh. They wanted the fluids inside me. I swung the baton as the first one lunged. The steel connected with its skull, not with a wet thud, but with a crack like breaking pottery. Dust puffed out from the impact, spores. I held my breath, kicking it back. It felt light, hollowed out, but incredibly strong. Its claw snagged my jacket, tearing through the heavy canvas like it was tissue paper. I backed into the hallway, slamming the infirmary door and jamming the baton through the handles just as bodies slammed against it. The wood splintered, dry and brittle. I ran. I needed the armory. I needed stopping power. The map in the lobby had shown the armory on level 3. I vaulted the railing of the stairwell, dropping 12 feet to the landing below. The impact jarred my teeth, but the adrenaline masked the pain. Level 3 was a maze of solitary confinement cells. The noise from above, the shrieking, the grinding of dry skin on concrete, was getting louder. They were fast. I saw the heavy steel door labeled Armory at the end of the hall. A red light blinked on the keypad. Biometric. Handprint required. I cursed, spinning around. I needed a guard. I scanned the hallway. Bodies were strewn everywhere here, victims of a last stand. I found a corpse in a riot helmet, slumped against the wall, his hand resting on a shotgun. I grabbed the weapon, a Remington 870. I pumped it. The action was gritty but functional. I checked the guard's hand. It was a withered claw. I grabbed the wrist and dragged the corpse toward the door, the dry skin rasping against the floor. From the stairwell darkness, 3 shapes emerged. They scuttled on all fours, moving along the walls and ceiling like geckos, their claws finding purchase in the porous concrete. The evolution was nightmare fuel. Without the weight of water, they defied gravity. I slammed the dead guard's hand onto the scanner. A red light buzzed. Access denied. Biomatter insufficient. The hand was too dry. The scanner couldn't read the print. The creatures were 30 feet away, closing the gap in bursts of jagged motion. I spat on the dead guard's palm, rubbing the moisture into the desiccated ridges of the thumb. A desperate, disgusting gamble. I slammed the hand back on the glass. Green light. The bolts retracted with a heavy clank. I threw myself inside and hit the manual lock just as a body slammed into the metal, the force of it vibrating through the door. I was in. The room was dark, smelling of gun oil and cold steel. I clicked my light on. Rows of racks. MP5s, shotguns, riot shields, and crates of ammunition. But on the back wall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a ventilation schematic. The prison's air filtration system was massive, designed to pull air from the surface and cycle it deep underground. But someone had bypassed the filters. A sticky note on the schematic read, "They are in the vents. They are the dust." I looked at the shotgun in my hands, then up at the vent grill and the ceiling of the armory. A fine, gray powder was drifting down from it, settling on the weapon racks. It wasn't dust. It was skin flakes. Spores. The entire prison wasn't just a containment facility. It was an incubator. The creatures outside were the drones. The hive was in the air system. I pulled my shirt over my nose, grabbed a gas mask from a hook on the wall, and sealed it tight. The hiss of the filter was the only sound in the room. I loaded the shotgun, shell by shell. The evolution of the virus in the Sahara had created a perfect cycle. The heat dried them out. They pulverized into infectious dust. The ventilation spread them, and any moisture, any intruder, woke them up to feed and restart the cycle. I wasn't just scavenging weapons. I was standing inside the lungs of a giant, sleeping beast, and I had just woken it up. The transition from the blinding, white-hot dunes of the Sahara to the cool, stale abyss of the complex was physically painful. My eyes, adjusted to the relentless glare of a sun that had long since baked the world into submission, struggled to pierce the shadows of the airlock. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, the grit of the sand mixing with the salt, and clicked on my shoulder-mounted flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that had been suspended in silence for perhaps a decade. The air tasted of recycled oxygen, copper, and something sweeter, the chemical tang of industrial decay. I checked the Geiger counter on my wrist. The radiation levels were negligible. Whatever killed this place, it wasn't the bombs. Not down here. I pried the inner blast door open with the screech of metal on metal, a sound that echoed down the corridor like a dinner bell for the damned. I froze, rifle raised, heart hammering against my ribs. 30 seconds of silence followed. No shuffling, no moans, no guttural shrieks. Just the low, rhythmic hum of emergency power reserves that were somehow, miraculously, still kicking. This was a black site, off the books, buried deep enough to survive the apocalypse, but evidently not strong enough to keep it out. I moved forward, boots crunching on broken glass. The intake room was a scavenger's paradise, untouched by the looters who had picked the surface cities clean years ago. The skeleton of a guard sat behind the reinforced glass of the security booth, his uniform draped over bones that had whitened with age. I bypassed the door with a localized charge, a waste of good explosives, but I didn't have the codes, and stepped inside. The smell was ancient, dry death. I ignored the corpse and went for the lockers. Jackpot. 3 sealed distinct crates of military-grade rations. The vacuum-sealed MREs that tasted like cardboard but provided enough calories to keep a man moving for a day. I loaded them into my pack, feeling the comforting weight. Beside them, a crate of 56mm ammunition. I cracked a box open, checking the primers. No corrosion. The dry desert air, filtered through the complex's scrubbers, had preserved everything perfectly. I swapped my half-empty mag for a fresh one and topped off my rig. 200 rounds. I felt like a god. But it was the medical bay, deeper in the facility, that drew my attention. The objective wasn't just food, it was intel. I needed to know why the dead in the cities were slowing down, and why the ones out here were getting faster. I pushed through the double doors of the infirmary, the air getting noticeably colder. Here, the signs of a struggle were evident. Gurneys overturned, for stands bent into abstract shapes, and scratch marks, deep, gouged furrows, in the steel walls. Not scratch marks from fingernails. These were from something harder, sharper. I approached a workstation, wiping a layer of dust from a terminal. The screen flickered to life, amber text scrolling against black. Subject 804. Mutation cycle, Phase 4. Xerothermic adaptation. I frowned, tapping the keys to expand the file. The logs detailed the facility's purpose. They weren't just holding prisoners. They were testing the infection in extreme environments. They wanted to see if the virus could survive the Sahara. The answer, apparently, was yes, but not without changing. The log read, "The pathogen has ceased necrotic decay to preserve host moisture. Tissue is hardening. Calcification of the dermis observed. Subjects are entering a cryptobiotic state similar to lungfish. They do not rot. They wait." A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning spiked down my spine. They wait. I looked around the room, really looking this time. On the far wall, what I had initially taken for piles of discarded hazmat suits were actually bodies. But they weren't slumped in death. They were huddled knees to chests, tucked into the corners of the room. Their skin was gray, taut, and looked like cracked clay. No fluids leaked from them. They looked like statues carved from dried mud. I stepped back, my boot heel clicking loudly on the tile. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. One of the statues twitched. It wasn't the groggy, stumbling wake up of the fresh infected. It was instantaneous. The creature uncoiled with the snapping sound of dry tendons stretching. It stood up, its height unnatural, limbs elongated and thin. The face was a nightmare of evolution. The nose and ears had receded, leaving only slits. The eyes were gone, covered by a thick, translucent film of callus. It hunted by sound. It hunted by vibration. The xerothermic adaptation. It had shed everything it didn't need to survive the heat, becoming a dried-out husk of efficient murder. I raised my rifle, flicking the safety off. The click was all it needed. The thing moved with a jerking, insectoid speed, closing the 20 feet between us in a blur. I fired. The muzzle flash lit up the room, a strobe light of horror. The bullets hit the creature, but there was no spray of blood. Dust and chips of calcified skin exploded from the impact points, like shooting a plaster wall. The rounds didn't penetrate deep enough to stop it, they just cracked the armor. It slammed into me, knocking the wind from my lungs. It felt like being hit by a bag of rocks. The smell was overpowering, not rot, but ammonia and old dust. It pinned me, its fingers, now fused into osseous claws, scrabbling at my tactical vest. The ceramic plate held, but the force bruised my ribs. I kicked out, driving my boot into its knee. There was a dry crack, like a branch snapping, and the leg buckled backward. It didn't scream. It hissed, a sound like sand pouring over stone. I scrambled back, abandoning the rifle that had been knocked from my grip, and drew my sidearm. I aimed for the head. The first shot ricocheted off its forehead, leaving a white gouge. The second went into the open mouth as it hissed. That did it. The round blew out the back of the skull in a cloud of gray powder. The thing collapsed, twitching violently before going still. I lay there, gasping, staring at the ceiling. One. That was just one. The log said. Subjects. Plural. From the hallway outside, and from the shadowy corners of the room I was still in, I heard it. The sound of dry leather stretching. The sound of knuckles popping. The sound of statues waking up. The gunfire hadn't just killed one, it had rung the dinner bell for the rest of them. The hive was awake. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my rifle. My hands were shaking, but I forced the magazine change, dropping the half-spent one. I needed armor-piercing rounds, but I only had ball ammo. I had to aim for the joints, the eyes, the mouths. I looked at the loot bag, the food, the water. The water. An idea, desperate and stupid, formed. I grabbed a canteen from my belt, unscrewed the cap, and splashed the water onto the corpse of the creature I just killed. The reaction was immediate. The gray, dusty flesh sizzled, absorbing the moisture greedily, softening, turning into a black sludge. The virus craved water so badly it destabilized the host's structural integrity when exposed to it rapidly. They weren't just adapted to the dry, they were dependent on it to maintain their armor. I looked at the fire suppression system on the ceiling. The red pipes ran the length of the complex. If this place still had power, maybe the pump still worked. Maybe there was still water in the reservoir. The first of the swarm burst through the door. There were 3 of them, moving with that same terrifying, jerky speed. I opened fire, spraying the doorway to suppress them, backing up toward the emergency alarm pull station on the far wall. Bullets chipped away at them, slowing them down but not stopping them. They were relentless, driven by a biological imperative that had been refined in the hellish crucible of this prison. "Come on, you dusty bastards!" I gritted out, slamming the stock of my rifle into the alarm lever and yanking it down. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a groan echoed through the building, deep and metallic. The pipe shuddered. The sprinkler heads above hissed, sputtering brown sludge before clearing into a spray of stale, pressurized water. The effect was catastrophic for them. As the water hit the creatures, they shrieked, a sound that finally gave them a voice. Their hardened carapaces began to slough off, turning to mush. They clawed at their own faces, blinded and softening. The armor that made them invincible to small arms fire was melting away. I didn't watch them die. I turned and ran, boots slipping on the wet tile, sprinting for the stairwell. The water soaked me, cooling the desert heat in my bones, but I knew I couldn't stay. The suppression system would run dry eventually, or the noise would draw things from the lower levels that were too big to care about a little rain. I had the food, I had the ammo, and I had the intel. The infection was evolving, becoming something elemental. The desert wasn't a barrier to them anymore, it was an incubator. I hit the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the screams of the melting statues fading behind me. I had to get back to the surface. I had to warn the settlement. The dead weren't just walking anymore, they were adapting. And if these things ever made it out of the desert, if they ever reached the humid zones, God help us all. The heat out here isn't just the temperature, it's a predator. It hunts you, pressing down on your shoulders with the weight of an anvil, sucking the moisture from your breath before you can even exhale. But the structure I found rising out of the dunes wasn't a mirage. It was a monolith of brutalist concrete, half swallowed by the shifting Sahara sands, standing like a tombstone for the old world. A high-security black site. An abandoned underground prison. I scrambled down the leeward side of a massive dune, sliding into the shadow of the blast doors. They were slightly ajar, jammed by a catastrophic mechanical failure years ago, the gap just wide enough for a desperate man to squeeze through. The transition was instant and violent. I went from the blinding, white-hot glare of the desert noon to a suffocating, cool darkness that smelled of stagnant air and copper. I clicked on my tack light, the beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, undisturbed for who knows how long. My boots crunched on glass, the shattered remains of the security checkpoint booth. First priority, water. Second priority, security. I moved with the practiced slow walk of a scavenger who has survived year 3, keeping my weight on the outer edges of my feet to dampen the sound. The lobby was a massacre site, but time had been kind in a grotesque way. The arid desert air had mummified the bodies rather than letting them rot. They were husks, skin pulled tight over bone like parchment, frozen in their final moments of terror. I stepped over a guard whose hands were still clutched around a 9mm pistol. I pried it loose, a Beretta, choked with sand. Useless without a full strip and clean, but I took the magazine. The rounds were clean. I pushed deeper, past the administrative wing and toward the cell blocks. The air grew colder as the ramp descended. This wasn't just a prison. The signage on the walls, faded and peeling, indicated levels of containment I'd never seen before. Biosafety Level 4. Containment Wing. This place was a vault for things the world wanted to forget. I found a break room on the first subterranean level. Scavenging is about patience. I checked the cupboards. Empty. I checked the vending machines. Smashed. But behind a tip-over refrigerator, I found a jackpot, a forgotten stash of maintenance supplies. Duct tape, a heavy-duty wrench, and a box of N95 masks. I put one on immediately. The air down here tasted metallic, and I knew better than to breathe deep in a tomb. Then came the noise. It wasn't the wet, gurgling moan of the shamblers back in the cities. This was different. A dry clicking. Like two stones being struck together underwater. I froze, killing the light. In the pitch black, my hearing amplified. Asterisk click. Scrape. Click. Asterisk, it was coming from the ventilation shaft above me. I pressed my back against the concrete wall, gripping my crowbar until my knuckles turned white. The vent grate 10 feet away exploded outward. Something dropped to the floor with a heavy, chitinous thud. I flicked the light back on and saw it. The infection, it had changed. In the cities, the virus turns people into rotting sacks of fluid. Here, in the desiccation of the desert and the dark isolation of the prison, the host's bodies had adapted. The thing crouched before me was humanoid, but its skin had hardened into a gray, callous armor, cracking and reforming like tectonic plates. Its eyes were gone, sealed over by the same calcified growth. It was blind, but the way its head twitched told me it was hunting by sound, by vibration. It let out a hiss that sounded like escaping steam. I didn't wait. I swung the crowbar with everything I had. The impact jarred my arms up to the shoulders. It was like hitting a brick wall. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, harmonic resonance that made my teeth ache, and lunged. It was fast. Terrifyingly fast. It didn't shamble. It scrambled on all fours like a spider. I sidestepped, bringing the crowbar down again, aiming for the joints. A sickening crack echoed as I shattered its elbow. It didn't bleed red. A thick, black sludge oozed from the wound, smelling of tar and ammonia. It snapped at me, teeth replaced by jagged ridges of bone. I kicked it back, creating distance, and brought the heavy wrench down on its skull. Once. Twice. 3 times. The plating finally gave way, and the creature went limp. I stood there, panting, the silence of the prison rushing back in to fill the void. This was bad. If the infection was evolving armor, standard ballistics would be useless. I needed armor-piercing rounds or explosives. I moved faster now, adrenaline overriding caution. I needed to find the armory or the infirmary. I descended to level 3. The doors here were heavy steel, mag-locked. Most were sealed, but one cell stood open. I swept the light inside. The walls were covered in scratches, frantic gouges deep into the concrete. And writing, scrawled in what looked like charcoal or dried blood. They don't die. They harden. The darkness feeds the shell. I swallowed hard. I was walking into a nest of these things. I found the infirmary near the central hub of Level 3. The glass was intact. I used the glass cutter on my multi-tool, carefully scoring a circle and popping it out. Silent entry. The hall was incredible. In the chaos of the outbreak, the staff must have abandoned the sick bay early. I found unopened crates of broad-spectrum antibiotics, sealed saline bags, and miraculously, a locked cabinet of opiates. Painkillers are the new gold standard of currency. I loaded my pack, prioritizing weight versus value. I left the saline, too heavy, but took every pill bottle I could find. On a desk I found a clipboard. The date was 6 months after the initial outbreak. Someone had been alive down here, studying them. I skimmed the notes. Subject 14 shows signs of epidermal calcification. The virus is pulling minerals from the bone density to reinforce the skin. They are becoming exoskeletal. Fire is ineffective. The shell acts as insulation. Extreme cold makes them brittle. Useful intel. But I didn't have liquid nitrogen. I had a crowbar. I left the infirmary and headed for the sublevel access. The armory would be in the security sector, likely near the warden's office on the lowest floor. As I reached the stairwell, I looked down into the abyss of the central shaft. Hundreds of feet down. And I saw them. Not one or two. Hundreds. They were clinging to the walls of the shaft, motionless, like bats in a cave. Dormant. Waiting. My light had grazed one, and I saw a ripple of movement. They were sensitive to light too, or maybe just the heat of the beam. I dimmed the light to its lowest setting, covering the lens with my fingers to let only a sliver of illumination through. The descent to level 5 was an exercise in terror. Every creak of the metal stairs sounded like a gunshot. I reached the bottom. The security station was a fortress within a fortress. The door was battered, marked by deep claw marks, but it had held. The electronic lock was dead. I had to use the hand crank for the manual override. It groaned, a rusted, screeching sound that echoed up the shaft. Above me, the clicking started. A cascade of it. Like rain on a tin roof. They were waking up. I cranked harder, muscles burning, sweat stinging my eyes. The door opened enough for me to slip through. I dove inside and slammed the manual bolt home just as something slammed into the metal from the other side. The impact shook the floor. I was in. I turned my light to the room. Racks. Empty racks. My heart sank. The place had been looted. But then I saw it, the tactical locker in the back, the one reserved for riot control. It was untouched. I smashed the lock. Inside wasn't guns, but something better for this environment. A riot shield with a hardened polycarbonate face, a stun baton, likely dead, but a good bludgeon, and a flare gun with a bandolier of shells. I grabbed the flare gun. If they hated light, and if they were sensitive to heat, maybe this was a weapon. The banging on the door was getting louder. The metal was beginning to warp. The calcified ones were strong. I looked around for an exit. A maintenance hatch in the floor. Access to the water filtration pipes? It was a gamble. I spun the wheel on the hatch. It was stuck. I used the wrench for leverage. The door behind me buckled, a jagged, gray hand tearing through the steel like it was cardboard. I heaved on the wrench. The hatch popped open with a hiss of pressurized air. I dropped the flare gun into my belt, grabbed the shield, and slid into the pipe just as the security door tore off its hinges. I scrambled through the tight, claustrophobic tunnel, the sound of scrambling claws behind me. This pipe led out, maybe to an outflow in the desert, maybe deeper into hell. But as I crawled, I realized the evolution wasn't just physical. They had worked together to breach that door. Hive mind? Or just pack instincts intensified? I stopped for a second to catch my breath, listening. The clicking was in the pipe with me. I pulled the flare gun, aimed it back down the dark tunnel, and squeezed the trigger. The magnesium burst ignited with a blinding white brilliance. The screeching that followed wasn't just pain, it was panic. The heat in the confined space amplified. I scrambled forward, the red glow of the dying flare illuminating the path ahead. The pipe was widening. I saw moonlight ahead. An outflow grate. I kicked it open and tumbled out onto the sand, gasping for the hot night air. I was out. But I knew what was sleeping beneath the dunes now. And I knew they wouldn't stay underground forever. The silence in the Sahara is heavy, a crushing weight of nothingness, but down here, inside the bowels of the subterranean penal colony, the silence had teeth. I adjusted the strap of my respirator, the rubber digging into the sweat-slicked skin of my neck. The air scrubbers had failed years ago, leaving the atmosphere stale and tasting of recycled copper and ancient dust. My flashlight beam cut a harsh cone through the suspended particulates, illuminating the stenciled letters on the blast door. Sector 4, Max SEC/Biocontainment. This wasn't just a prison. The maps I'd pulled from the rusted terminal in the warden's office confirmed it. This was a deep storage facility for things the world wanted to forget even before the world ended. The heat of the desert above didn't reach this deep. It was unnervingly cool, a refrigerator for the dead. I moved with the practiced, rolling gait of a scavenger, weight on the balls of my feet, avoiding the loose grate panels that clattered like dinner bells. Scavenging in the desert usually meant picking through sun-bleached bones and empty jerry cans, but this was a time capsule. The first room I cleared was a guard station. The skeletal remains of 3 officers sat in an eternal card game, their uniforms draped over bones that had been picked clean not by rats, but by time and dehydration. I wasn't interested in them. I was interested in the heavy, locked locker against the far wall. I wedged the crowbar into the seam, the screech of tearing metal echoing too loudly in the corridor. Inside, jackpot. A box of 9mm Hydroshock rounds, a tactical vest that hadn't seen UV light in a decade, and, miraculously, a sealed crate of emergency water rations. The foil pouches were bloated but intact. I stashed them into my ruck, the added weight a comfort rather than a burden. Survival is a math equation, calories in versus energy out, ammunition expended versus threats neutralized. Right now, the math was looking good. Too good. I pushed deeper, past the administrative wing and into the cell blocks. Here, the infection told a different story. In the cities, the infected rot. They bloat, they burst, they liquefy. But the Sahara is an arid hellscape, and it had changed them. The bodies in the cells weren't rotting, they were mummified. The virus, starved of moisture, had forced a dormant state. They looked like statues carved from dried leather, lips pulled back over teeth that seemed too long for their skulls. I approached a cell cautiously. Subject 894. He was standing, pressed against the bars, fingers fused around the iron. His eyes were gone, just hollow sockets filled with sand, but the virus was adaptable. That was the terrifying truth I was beginning to learn. It didn't just animate the dead, it evolved to survive the environment. As I passed, the floor vibrated. A low, rhythmic thrumming. I froze, killing my light. In the pitch black I heard it, the sound of dry parchment crumbling. Click, click, click. I thumbed the safety off my rifle. The thermal scope flared to life, painting the world in shades of blue and gray. The statue in cell 894 was moving. The lack of moisture had made their joints brittle, snapping with every movement, but it had also hardened their skin into a natural armor. Like cured rawhide. He slammed against the bars, the sound like a gunshot. The noise woke the block. Down the corridor, dozens of thermal signatures flared from cold blue to a dull, simmering red as their metabolisms kick-started from dormancy. They didn't moan, their vocal cords were dried husks. They chattered, snapping their jaws in a frenzy of hunger that had been on pause for years. I didn't stay to fight the whole block. I sprinted, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I vaulted a barricade of overturned desks. I needed the armory, and I needed the lab data. The evolution of the infection here was critical. If the virus could survive total dehydration, it meant the quarantine zones in the north were useless. The desert wasn't a barrier, it was a preservative. I slid under a half-closed blast door, coming up into the infirmary. The air here was different, humid. A broken pipe somewhere in the walls had been leaking for years, creating a micro-ecosystem in the dark. This is where the scavenging turned from tactical acquisition to a horror show. I was looking for antibiotics, painkillers, anything to trade or use. I rifled through cabinets, sweeping vials of expired morphine into my bag. Better to have it and not need it. Then I saw the containment logs on a tablet that still held a 4% charge. Subject 12. Fungal symbiosis. Moisture accelerates rapid mutation. I looked up. The ceiling wasn't concrete. It was meat. A thick, carpet-like biomass had grown over the leaking pipes, pulsing gently. And hanging from it, suspended in gelatinous sacks, were the staff. These weren't the dried-out husks from the cell block. These were the evolved. The constant moisture and the confined space had turned them into something else entirely. Their limbs were elongated, joints reversed, fingers fused into bone spurs. They were blind, having lost their eyes to the fungal overgrowth, but the slits on their necks flared as I exhaled. Echolocation. Or pheromone sensing. I slowly backed away, my boot crushing a glass vial. The sound was microscopic, but in that room, it was a thunderclap. The ceiling tore open. 3 of them dropped, landing on all fours with a wet slap. They were fast, moving like spiders. I raised the rifle, putting a burst into the center mass of the lead creature. The bullets didn't just penetrate, they caused the creature to rupture, spraying acidic bile that hissed as it hit the floor tiles. The infection here wasn't just maintaining the host, it was weaponizing the body fluids. I rolled to the left as a stream of bile melted the gurney I had been standing next to. I switched to the shotgun I'd strapped to my back, my breech tool. Close quarters required brute force. I pumped a slug into the head of the second creature. It exploded in a shower of gore and spores. I held my breath, the respirator my only lifeline against the airborne contagion. The third one lunged, pinning me against the cabinets. It was strong, unnaturally so, its muscle mass hypertrophied by the virus. I jammed the muzzle of the shotgun into its exposed ribcage and pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised my shoulder, but the creature was blasted backward, severed in half. I didn't wait to see if it would regenerate. I grabbed a hard drive labeled pathogen_genome_v4 from the desk and ran. The layout of the prison was a vertical shaft. I needed to get higher, back to the dry levels where the things were brittle and slow. I hit the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. My lungs burned, the dry air of the upper levels rasping in my throat as I ascended. I could hear the wet, slapping sounds of the things from the infirmary pursuing, but they slowed as the air got drier. They couldn't survive up here. The environment that created the husks was poison to the slick skins. I reached the level 2 security checkpoint and welded the door shut with a portable thermite strip I'd been saving for a vault. The sparks showered down, sealing the horrors below. I collapsed against the wall, checking my haul. Water, ammo, meds, and the data. I pulled a strip of jerky from my pocket, ironic, considering the dried horrors I'd just evaded, and chewed slowly. The prison was a goldmine, but it was also a petri dish. The infection was bifurcating, adapting to extremes. The dry dead and the wet dead. I checked my magazine. 20 rounds left in the rifle. 6 shotgun shells. I was rich by wasteland standards, but as I listened to the scratching on the other side of the welded door, I knew the currency of the new world was inflation-prone. The cost of living had just gone up. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I'd heard in 3 weeks, a mechanical scream that shattered the silence of the Sahara. The heat shimmering off the dunes had been hallucination-grade. A wavering curtain of 120 degrees that cooked the moisture right out of my pores, but as the heavy steel slab groaned open, a gust of stale, refrigerated air hit me like a physical blow. It smelled of ozone, old rubber, and the coppery tang of dried blood. I slipped through the gap before the hydraulics could fail, the darkness of the intake tunnel swallowing me whole. My Geiger counter clicked once, a lonely sound in the dark, then settled into a rhythmic, low-frequency purr. Safe levels. For now. I clicked on my tactical light, the beam cutting through the suspended dust motes. This wasn't just a prison. The architecture was too brutalist, too reinforced. The walls were lined with conduit piping and heavy cabling, distinct markings of a black site facility designed to keep things in, sure, but also to survive the apocalypse. I moved toward the security checkpoint, my boots crunching on something brittle. Looking down, I saw beetles, thousands of them, dead and dried into husks, forming a carpet over the concrete. Whatever had happened here, it had starved the vermin first. Scavenging is an art form born of desperation, and the intake room was a masterclass in disappointment tempered by necessity. The guards' lockers had been rifled through, likely by the staff themselves before the end, but they had been panicked. They missed the essentials. I found a half-empty box of CR-123 batteries rolled under a bench, gold dust from my flashlight, and a sealed blister pack of water purification tablets. But the real prize was in the evidence locker. It had been pry-barred open, but on the top shelf, ignored in favor of weapons, was a box of sterile saline 4 bags. In the desert, hydration is life, but sterile hydration is a miracle. I loaded 4 bags into my ruck, the weight reassuring against my spine. I pushed deeper, moving past the administrative wing toward the cell blocks. The silence here was different. Outside, the desert silence is vast and open. Here, it was pressurized. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The walls of the corridor were smeared with a substance that looked like black mold, but when I ran my gloved finger near it, the texture was wrong. It was crystalline. Hard. Sharp. It didn't smear. It crumbled like obsidian dust. This was the first sign that the infection down here hadn't followed the surface rules. Surface zombies are wet works, rotting flesh, fluid exchange, biological decay. But in the hyper-arid environment of the Sahara, combined with whatever containment protocols this prison had initiated, the pathogen had evolved. Or adapted. I found the first one in the mess hall. It wasn't slouching. It was standing perfectly still, facing the corner. The skin was drawn tight over the bones, looking like cured leather, dark and terrifyingly preserved. No rot. No smell of decomposition. Just desiccation. I raised my carbine, aiming for the base of the skull. I took a step, and the floor squeaked. The thing didn't moan. It didn't shamble. It snapped around with the speed of a springing trap. Its eyes were gone, replaced by cloudy, crystallized orbs that reflected my flashlight beam. It shrieked, a sound like grinding stones, and launched itself over a table. The movement was jerky, insectal. I fired twice. The rounds hit center mass, puffs of dry dust exploding from its chest, but it didn't slow down. The kinetic energy knocked it back, but there was no hydrostatic shock to the tissue because there was no fluid left. It was a marionette of bone and sinew driven by a virus that had learned to survive without water. I adjusted my aim and put a round through its eye socket. The skull shattered, literally shattered like pottery, and the thing collapsed into a pile of dry limbs. I stood over it, heart hammering against my ribs. This was bad. Traditional ballistics relied on tearing flesh and causing bleed out or massive trauma. These things were already dead and dried. Shooting them was like shooting a stack of firewood. You had to destroy the structure, break the load-bearing bones. I moved on, more cautious now, swapping a fresh mag. I needed to find the infirmary, or the lab. If this facility was studying the infection, they might have data on this strain. The descent to level 2 was a nightmare of claustrophobia. The emergency lighting flickered in a strobe effect, revealing glimpses of the horrors in the cells. They were packed in there. Dozens of them. Standing shoulder to shoulder, motionless, dormant in the dark, waiting for a stimulus. I realized with a jolt of terror that they were likely preserving energy, entering a cryptobiotic state until prey arrived. My heat signature, my moisture, was a dinner bell. I found the medical research wing behind a biohazard blast door that had been sabotaged. The keypad was smashed, sparks spitting from the wires. I used the hand crank on the manual override, straining until my muscles burned, opening it just enough to squeeze through. The air inside was colder, sterile, and smelled of formaldehyde. This is where the scavenging turned from survival to revelation. The shelves were stocked. Antibiotics, painkillers, adrenaline injectors. I swept entire shelves into my bag, greed warring with weight limits. But on the central desk, surrounded by microscopes, was a leather-bound logbook. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. I skipped to the final entries. Asterisk. Subject 114 shows total fluid rejection. The pathogen is hydrophobic now. It purges water from the host to create a crystalline lattice structure within the muscle fibers. It makes them brittle, but fast. Incredibly fast. They don't need blood oxygen. The crystals act as a piezoelectric conductor. They run on latent electrical impulses. Heat makes them faster. Cold slows them down. God help us if the AC fails. Asterisk. I looked up at the vent above me. The low hum of the air cycler was the only thing keeping the temperature down here at a manageable 60 degrees. If the generator out back ran dry, this entire prison would heat up, and these things would wake up fully. I was standing in a powder keg. Suddenly, a glass beaker on a nearby tray vibrated. Then another. I froze. The floor was trembling. Not an earthquake. Footsteps. Many of them. Rhythmic, synchronized pounding coming from the hallway I had just left. The noise of the blast door opening had traveled. The vibration of my own pulse, the moisture of my breath in the dry air. I was a beacon. I scrambled to the back of the lab, looking for a secondary exit. Nothing but reinforced concrete. I was cornered. I looked back at the logbook. Asterisk. Piezoelectric conductor. Asterisk electrical impulses. I scanned the room, eyes landing on a portable defibrillator unit and a wall-mounted fire suppression system marked halon oxygen displacement. I grabbed the defibrillator, charging the paddles. The whine of the capacitor was high and sharp. The door I'd squeezed through was suddenly filled with a silhouette. It was a brute, a prisoner who must have been massive in life, now a hulking frame of dried, corded muscle and jagged bone spurs where the infection had pushed through the skin. It ducked to enter, its movements twitchy and unnatural. It didn't roar. It clicked. A rapid-fire echolocation sound coming from its throat. Behind it, I saw more glowing, crystallized eyes. I had seconds. I ripped the safety pin off the halon suppression lever and kicked the valve open. A hiss of gas flooded the room, instantly dropping the temperature and sucking the oxygen out of the air. I held my breath, my lungs burning. The brute faltered, the sudden cold making its movements sluggish, the crystal lattice in its muscles contracting too fast. It took a step and stumbled, a cracking sound echoing from its knee. I lunged forward, not with my gun, but with the defibrillator paddles. I slammed them into the dry, papery chest of the creature and hit the discharge button. The effect was catastrophic. The electrical surge didn't restart a heart. It overloaded the crystalline network the logbook had described. The brute convulsed violently, arcs of blue electricity jumping across its skin as the crystals shattered internally. It exploded outward, a fragmentation grenade of bone shards and dust. The force knocked me back into the counters, glass raining down on me. I didn't wait to see if the others were deterred. I scrambled over the pile of dust that used to be the brute, coughing in the halon fog, pushing through the gap in the door. I sprinted back toward the intake, the adrenaline masking the exhaustion. The prison was waking up around me. I could hear the scratching inside the walls, the pipes rattling as things crawled through the infrastructure. The infection here wasn't just biology anymore. It was geology. It was physics gone wrong. I had my water, I had my meds, but as I burst back out into the blinding, searing heat of the Sahara sun, I realized the worst part. The logbooks said heat made them faster, and I was leaving the cool underground for the furnace of the desert. If they followed me up here, if they adapted to the surface temperature, I wasn't just survival scavenging. I was prey in an open oven. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I'd heard in weeks. It didn't open fully, just enough for me to squeeze through sideways, trading the blistering anvil of the Saharan sun for the stagnant, recycled air of the vestibule. The thermometer on my tactical watch read 48 degrees Celsius outside. Inside, it dropped rapidly, but the air tasted metallic, like copper pennies and ancient dust. This wasn't just a prison. The thick reinforced concrete and the isolation suggested a black site, a place designed to be erased from maps. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the dead air. I needed water. My canteen was light, sloshing with the last tepid dregs of what I'd siphoned from a stalled Land Rover 2 days back. The thirst was a physical weight, a clamp tightening around my throat. I cleared the security checkpoint first. The skeletal remains of a guard sat behind bulletproof glass, slumped over a console that had been dead for years. Unlike the bloaters in the cities or the shamblers in the temperate zones, this corpse wasn't a biological hazard of fluid and rot. The desert had mummified him. His skin was pulled tight over bone, turning him into a statuesque horror of leather and teeth. I bypassed the mag lock on the door with a crowbar, the screech of metal echoing dangerously down the corridor. Inside the booth, I hit the jackpot, not gold, but plastic. A half crate of bottled water tucked under the desk. The plastic had degraded slightly, crinkling loudly, but the seals held. I downed one in a single breath, the plastic tasting of leached chemicals, but the hydration was divine. I swept the lockers with frantic efficiency. A Glock 17 with one spare magazine, a stun baton with a battery that had leaked acid long ago, and a riot vest. I strapped the vest on. It was heavy, but the psychological weight of protection was worth the sweat. The map on the wall showed 4 levels. I was on level 1, administration and intake. The real supplies, the cafeteria, the armory, the infirmary, were down in the bowels. I descended the stairwell, my boots crunching on grit that sounded too much like pulverized bone. Level 2 was general population. The smell hit me here. It wasn't the sweet, cloying stench of necrosis I was used to. It was earthy, musky, like a tomb opened after a millennia. The silence was absolute, a predator in itself. I swept my light across the cell block. Open doors. Why were they all open? Movement. Not the dragging shuffle of the fresh dead. This was a dry scrape, like sandpaper on stone. I froze, aiming the beam. In the corner of an open cell, a pile of rags shifted. It stood up, disjointed and jerky. This thing, it wasn't right. The infection usually turned people into mindless, rage-filled bags of fluid. This creature was gaunt, stripped of all fat and moisture. Its skin was dark, hardened into a natural armor, cracked like a dried riverbed. It didn't groan. It clicked. A dry, throat-clicking sound caused by desiccated vocal cords rubbing together. It lunged. The speed was terrifying. Without the weight of water and flesh, it was pure muscle and tendons snapping tight. I fired. The round hit center mass, but instead of a wet thud, there was a dry crack, like striking hickory wood. The creature didn't even stumble. The bullet had punched through the leathery hide, but there was no hydrostatic shock to stop it. It slammed into me, knocking the wind out of my lungs. Its claws, fingernails hardened into obsidian-like hooks, raked across the riot vest. I kicked it back, the force feeling like kicking a bag of rocks. I aimed for the head. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space. The skull shattered, dust puffing out instead of gray matter. It dropped, twitching not with nerves, but with the release of tension in dried ligaments. I scrambled back, keeping the gun trained on the hallway. The noise would draw them. I knelt by the corpse, my hands shaking. I had to know what I was dealing with. I pulled my knife and tried to cut the arm. It was like sawing through cured jerky. Inside, there was no liquid blood. The veins were filled with a dark, crystalline resin. The virus. It had adapted. In the absence of moisture, it had crystallized the host's fluids, putting them into a form of aggressive estivation. They weren't rotting. They were curing. This meant they could last for decades, maybe centuries, in this state, waiting for hydration. Waiting for fresh blood to liquefy their insides again. I needed to keep moving. The gunshot was a dinner bell. I heard the clicking starting up and down the cell block. A chorus of dry insects, growing louder. I ran for the level 3 access. The infirmary. I needed antibiotics for the scratch on my leg from the trek, and I needed to understand what this place knew. I slammed the stairwell door and wedged the crowbar in the handle just as the first body hit it. Thuds impacted the other side immediately, hard, bony impacts that dented the steel. Level 3 was colder. The air was frigid, actually. Sub-basement cooling systems that relied on geothermal exchange might still be passively working. The infirmary was a sterile white nightmare. Gurneys were overturned, but the glass cabinets were intact. I smashed one, grabbing distinct orange bottles. Ciprofloxacin. Painkillers. Bandages. But it was the desk in the chief medical officer's office that caught my eye. A logbook, left open, dust settling on the final entry. I brushed the page clean. The handwriting was frantic, the ink faded. Subject 44 shows no signs of decomposition despite 14 days post-mortem. The pathogen is hygroscopic. It pulls moisture from the air to maintain mobility, but in arid conditions, it calcifies the host's internal structure. We thought the heat would kill it. We were wrong. The heat hardens them. It makes them faster. They don't need to eat to survive, they eat to hydrate. God help us, they are drinking us. A crash from the ventilation duct above me shattered the silence. The grate buckled. I looked up to see a face pressing against the metal mesh, a face that had fused with the metal. The skin growing over the grate like tree bark swallowing a fence. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. The vent gave way. It fell onto the desk, shattering the lamp. This one was larger, wearing the tattered remains of a riot squad uniform. The armor was fused to its body. The infection here didn't just preserve, it integrated. It pulled materials into the carapace to retain moisture. The polymer of the armor had melted into the flesh. I didn't wait. I bolted for the rear exit of the infirmary, heading toward the darkness of level 4, solitary and high security. The thing behind me scrambled over the desk with the agility of a spider, ignoring the broken glass. I could hear more of them in the vents now, a swarm of dried locusts in human shape. I had scavenged water, weapons, and medicine, but I had lost the element of surprise. The prison wasn't abandoned. It was a hive, and I had just kicked it. The stairs to level 4 spiraled down into pitch blackness. I didn't want to go down, but the clicking was coming from above. I checked my mag 12 rounds. I clicked the flashlight to its brightest setting and descended into the abyss, the dry, rasping